Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. Today we're going to discuss whether Europe is going to collapse, whether you need to flee now, what the problems are. And I'm referring specifically to kind of the current economic situation related to what we'll call the energy crisis, what's going on kind of between Russia and Germany and the rest of the EU, what I think is very logically going to happen, what that means for you, what you should be doing. And I think there's probably a really good reason that people who are EU-based should be having some redundancy to their plans. Let's put it that way. You should definitely be in a situation, I think, at this time. Let's put it this way. I'm not going to be in the EU during the winter, and I'm very glad that I'm not going to be in the EU this winter. I think it's a bad time to be there. It might turn out not so bad, but I think realistically, the uncertainty is pretty high. The quality of life is probably going to be pretty low. And so I'll go through all those details for you. Anyway, before we do that, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the all notification bell. Thank you for subscribing. If you like the video, share it with your friends. If you are if you're visiting us for the first time, I'm Michael from Offshore Citizen. We specialize in custom holistic international solutions for individuals and businesses, helping you to pay the lowest legal amount of tax possible, do international banking, form companies, get residencies and citizenships. We can help you with strategy and implementation. If those things are interesting to you, you would like help, please send us a message through offshorecitizen.net or reach out to me and book a call, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below, and I will be looking forward to talking to you. Okay. So, situation in Europe. Very quickly, for those who are not inside Europe or somehow inside Europe and not realizing what's going on, the energy prices in Europe have been going up a lot, and inflation in various parts of Europe has exceeded that of the U.S. And this looks potentially to get quite a bit worse. We're coming into winter, and that can be really bad. This is, largely there is a scarcity and rising costs due to scarcity of oil and gas. This has a lot to do with the relationship between Russia and the West. Some people have pointed out on a previous video that I did that Nord Stream 2 is completed and in theory could be certified and put into production, and you could have more gas flowing from Russia to Germany. But that I think it was in February that Germany stopped the certification process, and so it's there, it's available. There's various different participants who have gone bankrupt and laid off the staff, etc. So it's not actually so quick as like, oh, hey, just turn it on. You'd actually need to do some process in order to make that happen, but it's, mostly things are done. So there's some things that are possible and fairly quickly if they were to go ahead and do that. In the meantime, you have major financiers of this project who are potentially going to have to write down billion-dollar plus losses, and there's going to be lawsuits and all kinds of stuff that could happen over this. But in the meantime, you have, I think, a really important geopolitical thing happening, and that is going to be the second thing we're going to discuss. Before we discuss that, I want to kind of give my thoughts on what I think is just incredibly likely, I would say borderline obvious, of the next kind of three moves that will have to happen in this scenario. And this is, number one, we've already seen the start of this, the ECB will need to raise interest rates. And the reason for this is what's happening right now is the US dollar is outperforming the euro by quite a lot. And as it does that, this raises the inflation in the EU. So things become less and less affordable as foreign goods, including oil and gas, which are priced in US dollars, start to you just have less money to buy them with when the euro is declining relative to the dollar. So the ECB and the European Union need to protect the euro. They need to defend it. And the easiest, most logical starting point of a way to do that is to turn around and start raising interest rates. Simultaneously, there's a lot of political pressure on them to fight inflation. The reality is probably inflation doesn't have that much to do with interest rates. After all, we saw a long period of zero interest rates, in fact negative interest rates in some cases, without really much inflation, so to speak of. So you have other factors at work, but this can dampen demand and hopefully help them. So it's like the only corrective measure they have, and therefore they pretty much must do it. So I expect to see continued interest rate hikes from the ECB over the next little while. They did 75 basis points here not too long ago, and they'll probably do a bunch more. For those who aren't familiar, a basis point is basically 1/100%. So 75 basis points is 0.75%. Okay, but that puts them way behind the U.S., and so liquidity is just being drained out. I did a video on the dollar milkshake theory talking about sucking the liquidity out. So that's the first thing that's, to me, pretty apparent. The second thing that seems incredibly apparent is that they're going to need to try and put caps and controls on consumption and on prices. So they're going to say, okay, we want to dampen the demand, so hence we're just limiting how much you can consume. And there's various ways of doing that. One is things like rolling blackouts. I think I mentioned in, if I didn't mention it in a video, I put it on Twitter, that Serbia has authorized this. In some other places, they've already started doing this. They're obviously not EU countries, but I think just in general, this is going to be something that's going to happen. You're going to be in a situation where you have to somehow try and reduce demand, and so they're going to cap consumption, which isn't great for standard of living, quality of life, etc. for people within the EU, which is part of the reason why I say not really where I want to be this winter. Even worse if they do that for something related to heating and it's cold. Very bad combination. Not a big fan for me being there. Anyway, the next thing that I think is going to happen inherently out of these two things is they're going to have to do massive bailouts. And so we've already seen $65 billion authorized by Germany to start this. I mentioned it in a windfall tax video a little while back. And I think they're going to have to do a lot more. Why are they going to have to do a lot more? Two key reasons. Number one, because when you start putting these caps in place, you don't you don't cause the prices not to go up. You simply move where that price is paid. You basically move it from the consumers paying for it to somebody else paying for it, or else you have the supply sucked out of your market, and they cannot afford to reduce supply. They need to keep supply high, which means they need to bid up the prices, actually. That's what kind of allows them to keep going. But as they bid up the prices, this hurts the consumers. They're going to try and cap the consumers, so hence they need to fill in with this liquidity somewhere else. So individuals, businesses, etc., they're going to have to bail them out. Second of all, when they raise interest rates, this is going to create massive unaffordability for the countries. In particular, we're talking about the Southern European countries in this case. So Southern Europe isn't as affected by things like need to heat. And so, natural gas is not as big a deal for those countries as it's going to be for places like Germany. But you're going to be in a pretty bad situation with higher interest rates. And so the only way to deal with this, if you want to kind of maintain cohesion within the union, is going to be to do bailouts. And so this is going to be a really interesting scenario, because normally what happens is when you're trying to stimulate the economy, or ease things up in the case of some problems, what you do is you lower interest rates and you basically do bailouts. Here, I think they're going to be in a situation where they have to raise interest rates and do bailouts. So that's a really weird dynamic that's going to be at play. We'll see how it goes. And I mean, none of this is guaranteed, but I think this is, to me, really obvious that they pretty much have to do it in order to get through, unless they can do some sort of a deal with Putin, which we're going to talk about in a second. And even then, they may have to do this. In fact, they probably quite likely will need to do that. So, okay, that's the tapestry of what I think are the things. If you have other thoughts, put them below. We'd love to hear them. Now, what is the consequence of this? The consequence of this is, and we're already starting to see political resistance to the war in Ukraine rising, or rather political pressure to try and bring the war to an end, right? Now, my theory is that Putin is far more able to have the Russian people suffer for an extended period of time than the EU is to have the European people suffer for an extended period of time, right? So I just think that kind of the nature of these two countries, the political systems, etc., mean that Putin can play chicken much longer than the EU can play chicken. And that's basically what I see happening here. I see this big game of chicken happening. Russia has a bunch of problems. They're spending through reserves very quickly. They're denied various different pieces of technology coming into their country. Sanctions have a consequence on them. But that being said, Putin is basically responding by putting pressure on the EU. And so how do you address this? Well, the one logical situation is that the EU says, hey, let's make a deal with Putin. And in order to do that, they either need to betray Ukraine or they need to get Ukraine to go along for the ride, right? Now, if they are going to betray Ukraine, that doesn't seem so good. Now, up till this point in time, the world leaders, of various countries, or the European leaders rather, have said, we're going to stick with Ukraine as long as it takes, through whatever it takes. I suspect that political will crumbles as things get worse for average people. Not guaranteed, but I suspect you'll find more and more pressure for them to do something. And so they most likely, I think, probably have to get Ukraine to come on board with this, because you can't just totally throw Ukraine under the bus and abandon them. It's possible, but I think it's fairly unlikely. So what is a deal that will be accepted by Ukraine in order to be able to make a deal that will be accepted by Russia? Obviously, Russia is going to demand certain things, probably Crimea, the Donbass, probably ending of sanctions, or at least drastically lowering sanctions, possibly some sort of guarantees around NATO and Ukraine. That one I think is harder for them to push through, but we'll see. So some sort of deal would have to be there that will be acceptable to Putin, that will allow Putin to save face. Ukraine, of course, is not going to want that, right? And therefore, what's this going to involve? I think the logical thing is you're going to have an agreement to pour tens, hundreds of billions of dollars into rebuilding Ukraine. I think this is probably what's going to happen. It will probably largely be sucked up by corruption. Zelensky and a bunch of other people are probably going to get incredibly rich. But I just don't see that there's a reasonable way to kind of work with Ukraine without saying, hey, listen, do this for us, and we're going to pour, $200 billion into Ukraine, or whatever the number happens to be, right? A large amount of money into kind of rebuilding all this damage from the war. So that's one thing. Now, the problem I see with this is that I don't think that the US wants the war to end. I think that Americans are not really suffering. They don't really feel the pain that Europeans are feeling with these 1,000% increases in energy prices, and they're probably not going to. The US is relatively self-sufficient. The US is relatively insulated. And from their perspective, Russia is bleeding. They were sitting there just, this is just bleeding Putin. It's, great for them. The military-industrial complex has a bunch of new customers after losing their big customer in Afghanistan when things were pulled out of there. And, you're going after your big geopolitical enemy. You've got kind of some degree of rallying people around this cause. This is probably like one of the most successful wars for the US since the Soviet-Afghan War, because they don't have to have American troops in there, and yet, they're achieving this geopolitical end. So I suspect that their pressure will be not to have the EU turn around and push for a deal with Russia. And therefore, the question becomes, okay, can you even do a deal with Ukraine without the US backing it? Now, okay, sure, you could do something where Biden looks like the hero and goes and negotiates the big thing. I don't think it's a big enough win for the US to back that sort of a plan. We'll see, but it seems unlikely to me. I think that there is another alternative then, which is that the US may turn around and decide to bail out as much as they can the EU. And they would mainly do this probably by the Department of Treasury, would direct the Fed to start buying Euro bonds. That would be kind of the method of doing this. There's probably some other things they could do as well, but that would be kind of a big one. So those are kind of like some general geopolitical things for what I see over the coming, 6 to 12 months. Now, it's possible that, with enough changes, etc., you can push things through over the next, through the winter for Europe. But I think it's going to be pretty rough for Europe over the next several months, because I don't think you're going to come to a quick conclusion in this conflict. And this means Europe's probably not a great place to be, at least certainly certain parts of Europe, over the next little while. Or at least I wouldn't want to have it as my only place in the basket. So personally, I do maintain residency in the EU. I have that as well. But of course, my main residency is in Dubai, and so that's great. I have that as well as other residency options, so this is good for me. I think if I was in somebody's position, I think it's really a good idea to have some alternate options right now, some non-EU options. I love EU options because, an EU passport is strong, and, having a residency permit that gives you access to a broad area. And so, like, I think this is all great, but I think that having that as your sole plan right now is probably a really bad idea. And it is probably a good idea to be making some alternate plans for places in the world that are not going to be caught in the same effects as what's going on in the EU right now. So let me know what you guys think. That is my general opinion. So this, I guess, begs the question of where can you go? I think, it's pretty obvious there's not that many options. You can go to the Middle East, right? Dubai being the most dominant option, although you have Bahrain and some others, but Dubai/UAE being the most obvious one. Number two, you can go to Latin America. I've mentioned we help people quite often getting permanent residency in Mexico. That's a great backup plan. There's also Panama, there's Paraguay, there's Uruguay, there's the whole Latin America. So those are options that a person could look at. And then of course there's Asia. You have typically Thailand, Bali, possibly the Philippines. I haven't talked too much about it, but that's an option. Malaysia, and actually I'm going to do a video on, there's a new Singapore visa that is coming up. So there's a few options in that part of the world as well. So you have a bunch of places to go, and I think the wise thing is to be preparing in advance. Maybe nothing will happen. Maybe it turns out that everything is good for Europe over the next 12 months. But I think it's a good time to be putting some backup options in place. So if you want help with those things, reach out to us. I would love to hear your thoughts on what you think is going to happen and where the best places are to go. And I will look forward to seeing you on the next video.